Our fourth presenter today is going to be Dr. Gervais from the Classics Department, and he's going to be giving a talk entitled "The Spartans in Film and Comic Books."
Okay. Yes, so I'm talking about comic books and movies today. 3 different depictions of Sparta and how each of those depictions gives us kind of a different version of what Sparta is like. So this is my Sparta, is what they're saying. I've got the comic books up on the desk there, 303, and then we're also looking at the movie version of 300. So, who's seen 300, the movie? Oh gosh. Yeah, I'm getting old. That was a big thing when I was your age. Anyway, okay, a few people, so that's good. How about the comic book? Anyone read the comic book? Aha. 1998, Frank Miller with art by Lynn Varley. If you haven't read the comic book but you've seen the movie, you've pretty much read the comic book because the visuals are very, very similar. I'm going to be focusing on the scene there on the bottom right when King Leonidas kicks the messenger down into the well after yelling, "This is Sparta." Even if you haven't seen the film, maybe you've seen that one little clip. There was a sequel to the movie recently, 300 Rise of an Empire. We have anyone seen that? Yeah, I'm not talking about that, unfortunately. What I am going to talk about is another comic book called 3. Anyone read 3? That is well worth reading. If you like comic books at all, oh, come back. Good. If you like comic books at all, I would suggest reading it. It's not quite a sequel to 300, but it's sort of like a response to 300 or a different version of what Sparta would be like. So what I want to focus on is that scene from the beginning of the movie in the comic book 300 when the messenger arrives at Sparta and ends up being kicked down a well and the war starts. It's actually a scene right out of the history books. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us about it in the 7th book of his histories. He says that King Xerxes of Persia sent no heralds to Athens and Sparta to demand earth and water as a symbol of their submission to Persia, because when his father, King Darius, had sent men with the same purpose before, they were thrown into the pit at Athens, and they were thrown into a well in Sparta, and they were told to get earth and water for the king down there. So it's kind of a cool response. If someone asks you to surrender, you just throw the messenger down the well and say, "To hell with you." It's also highly illegal. It's very much against the law in the ancient world to harm a messenger or a herald. It's against the laws of men. It's also, yep.
Is that what the phrase "don't kill the messenger" comes from?
That is certainly what "don't kill the messenger" means. Yeah. It was much more of an actual serious law in the ancient world. Not only against men, but also against the gods. You were sinning if you killed a messenger. You were actually inviting the gods to curse you. And Herodotus knows this, so he says, "I don't know what disaster struck the Athenians for treating the heralds in this way, except that their land and their city was laid to waste during the war. But the Spartans provoked the anger of a messenger god, Talthybius, who had a shrine there. And after the crime, they couldn't get any good omen from sacrifice, and this was true until they actually sent 2 of their own men to Persia to be executed as sort of an atonement for this." So it was a really serious crime what King Leonidas did, executing the messenger. But you wouldn't know that based on the comic book. There's only 3 pages in the comic book that deal with this scene. There's the messenger arriving in Sparta. There is the messenger asking the king for earth and water as a symbol of his submission. And then on the last page, the king backs him up against a well and then kicks him down after yelling out, "This is Sparta." Hi, everyone. The comic book kind of goes out of its way to not care about the laws that King Leonidas is breaking. When the messenger asks to see the king, the Spartans say, "Yeah, I suppose we should show him where the king is. We don't want anybody saying that Spartans aren't good hosts." Being good hosts in the ancient world was more than just proper etiquette. It was the law of men and gods. If you weren't a good host, you were inviting the wrath of Zeus, for instance. But the Spartans don't seem to care. They're making a joke out of it here. The messenger asks for earth and water. King Leonidas says, "Don't be coy, don't be stupid. You can afford neither." That's the messenger's only warning that he's about to get into trouble. Remember that line because it's going to come up again when I talk about the movie. The messenger says, "Xerxes is on his way. You better surrender or else you'll be in trouble." Leonidas says, "Well, that's a bit of a problem. I don't want to seem like a wuss." Essentially, there must be a diplomatic solution to this. The messenger says, "Choose your next words carefully." That's another line we'll see in the movie in a second. And what Leonidas decides to do is kick him down a well. He says, "Earth and water, you'll find plenty of both down there." And the messenger says, "You're a madman. No man, Persian or Greek, no man threatens a messenger." That's true. Persians or Greeks, it didn't matter. You weren't supposed to hurt a messenger. You were sinning against the gods. You were breaking the law. Leonidas doesn't care. He's cool. He's like, whatever. The messenger tries again. "This is blasphemy. This is madness." And all Leonidas says is, "This is Sparta." And then he kicks him down the well. One last thing I want to point out about this scene before we sort of transition over to the movie is that this is the place where the messenger meets the king. It's the Spartan marketplace. Sparta in the comic book is filled with men. It's filled with soldiers. There aren't many women around. Really, the only prominent woman in this scene is the one in the red circle there. That's a woman with her bare breasts out. She's a prostitute. Sparta in the comic book is a land of soldiers, a land of prostitutes. It's a gritty place ruled over by a king that'll kick a messenger down a well just for looking at him the wrong way. And that would have worked really well for the comic books because stereotypically, who reads comic books? Let's say teenage boys.
Sure.
Not to stereotype. That's not entirely true, but yeah, and a certain type of teenage boys, right? And I don't want to stereotype teenage boys, but teenage boys are immature, right? They don't care about breaking the law as long as it's going to make them look cool. They'd probably kick a messenger down the well if you looked at them the wrong way. Then they'd go and make out with that prostitute. That would be awesome. This worked very well in the comic book. It would not work. It would not work particularly well in the film because if you want to have a successful film, you have to appeal to a lot more than just teenage boys. You have to appeal to men, older men. You have to appeal to women. You have to appeal to teenage girls. You want to have a big audience to have a successful film. So you need to have a different sort of hero than this hero that appeals to teenage boys. You need to have a more sympathetic hero, like you would have had. Oh, who's seen the movie Gladiator? Is that like way? Yeah. Sort of this reluctant hero, this family man that's finally forced into defending his family. That's the sort of Leonidas that we get in the movie. And the question is, how do you take the Leonidas from the comic book and turn him into a more sympathetic, broadly relatable Leonidas? One of the first things you do is you make the messenger a lot less sympathetic, so we don't care whenever he gets killed. This is the messenger arriving in Sparta in both the comic book and the film. The scene looks almost exactly the same, except for one small but important detail. In the movie, the messenger is carrying the chain with the skulls of all of the kings that tried to resist Persia. So the messenger in the movie, just like in the film, is saying a lot of polite and diplomatic things, but what he's holding in his hand is a symbol of how much of a threat he is for Sparta. I am the enemy. I am here. You need to protect yourself from me. So it's already a bit of justification for what Leonidas is eventually going to do. And I'm going to try to switch to, come on, some pictures. Got my statue there, yeah. Come on. Duplicate. There we go. A lot of pictures to get through. So the messenger is threatening the king. The king isn't taking the bait. He's a reluctant hero. He doesn't want to do any violence that he doesn't have to. He warns the messenger right at the start. He says, "Before you speak Persian, know that in Sparta, everyone, even a king's messenger, is held accountable for the words of his voice." He's warning the messenger that whatever you say will be held against you. That's not a line that's in the comic book. That's something they've added to make us be less sympathetic when the messenger finally seals his own fate. The messenger asks for earth and water. The king says, "You rode all the way from Persia for earth and water." That's a line right out of the comic book. So is this next line. "Don't be coy or stupid, Persian. You can afford neither." Remember, I circled that. In the comic book, that line was spoken by King Leonidas. In the film, it's spoken by his wife, Queen Gorgo. She's a character that's not really in the comic book. They've added her into the film to have a strong, sympathetic female character, someone that a larger audience can like. Maybe your mom, enjoys how strong Queen Gorgo is, or women will, or teenage boys will, or something. But there's more to latch onto. Yeah, there's more to latch onto than just this one king, right? The messenger says something sexist. What makes this woman think she can speak among men? She says something really cool, because only Spartan women give birth to real men. Leonidas tries to kind of calm them down. The messenger keeps threatening him. If you value your lives over your complete annihilation, listen carefully, Leonidas. All of these lines for the past couple slides have not been in the comic book. They were added to the movie. The messenger is a much more threatening character here. All the god King Xerxes requires is this, the simple offering of earth and water as a token of Sparta's submission to the will of Xerxes. You can see by Leonidas' face he doesn't like the idea of submission. He may be a reluctant hero or a careful king, but he's a man, and men don't submit to things. He says submission just to drive that point home. Right out of the comic book, we've got the words, choose your next words carefully, Leonidas. But then we have something added that wasn't in the comic book. One last threat. They may be your last words as king. Leonidas is being forced to do what's happening next. But he's not going to do it rashly. He's going to take his time and think about it. He does consider his next words carefully. He looks around at all the people that he's responsible for as the king of Sparta, the workers in the field, the women and the daughters that he needs to protect, the young boys that he needs to lead by example, his wife that is being the partner in all of the decisions that he makes. And with full knowledge of what he's about to do, he draws his sword on the Persian messenger. The messenger says right out of the comic book, "Madman, you're a madman. No man, Persian or Greek, no man threatens a messenger." This is true. Remember that Leonidas is breaking the law. He's sinning against God, or the gods rather. But he's had a lot of provocation for this. Things that the movie added that wasn't in the comic book. You bring the crowns and heads of conquered kings to my city steps. You insult my queen, that character that wasn't in the comic book. You threaten my people with slavery and death. Oh, I've chosen my words carefully, Persian. Perhaps you should have done the same. The messenger tries one more time. This is blasphemy. This is madness. Yes, the king knows. Unlike in the comic book, here he knows that he's really about to do something pretty major. He's going to commit a sin. He thinks about it one last time. He looks back at his wife for confirmation. She nods her head. Go ahead, this is the right thing to do. And then he says the cool line right out of the comic book, "Madness, this is Sparta." And then he kicks him down into the well. So we have the same sort of scene in both the comic book and the film. A messenger arrives. The Spartan king breaks the law by executing the messenger. But in the film, they've added a lot more so that we can relate to what the king has done, so we can sympathize. So he's not just acting the way that, if I'm stereotyping again, only a teenage boy would think was awesome. Now if I can safely get back to this. Come on. There we go. So the Sparta in 300, the comic book, and 300, the film, is subtly different. In the comic book, it's really gritty, it's badass. In the movie, it's a little bit more relatable to a broader audience. I want to give you one more version of Sparta for the last 5 minutes of my talk. It's in this comic book 3, which again, I think is well worth reading. It's pretty darn cool. It's by an author named Kieran Gillen that's done a lot of good stuff for Marvel comic books mostly. 3 is set 100 years after the events of 300 in Sparta. It tells the story of 3 Spartan slaves named Kleros, Damar, and Terpander. I wonder how many people knew that Spartans had slaves. Well done. It's not something that you would know, for instance, from watching 300, but these heroes of democracy and freedom did in fact have a whole race of slaves called the Helots that did not have particularly good lives. These 3 fictional slaves get in trouble, end up going on the run. The trouble starts when a Spartan leader called an ephor on the right there arrives at their home and demands hospitality. This reminds us of the arrival of the messenger in 300. So the scene in 3 is kind of referencing the scene in 300. The ephor demands hospitality. The messenger demanded hospitality to see the king. At the end of 300, the messenger gets kicked down a well. At the end of the scene in 3, the ephor executes all of his Helot hosts. So what I want to focus on for just a couple minutes is the way the Spartans are portrayed differently in 3 than they were in 300. In 300, the Spartans were heroes. In the comic book, they were sort of really gritty heroes. In the movie, they were a little bit more mainstream heroes. But either way, they were still heroes. In 3, the comic book, they're not heroes at all. They're villains. If anyone is a hero, it's the Helots. The Spartans behave very villainously. They break down a door. They demand hospitality from these frightened men and women and old people and children. They abuse their hosts. They force them to get drunk and dance around naked for their amusement. When one of the Helots throws up from too much wine, they force the rest of them to lick up the vomit. They're not being good guests, really. One of the Helots finally gets angry. He's about to say something. His friend Damar tries to stop him. She says, "Silence, Terpander. Dionysus, the god of wine, has your tongue." The Ephor's son says, "Woman, your will matters not. Women are treated differently by Spartans here than they were in 300. They're not given respect like Queen Gorgo was. They're just told to shut up." Terpander goes ahead and speaks. He tells a story of the only time in history when the Helots successfully fought back the Spartans. He's pretty happy with this story. Everyone else is very sad because they know that they're going to be punished for what he's just said. And indeed, the Ephor orders everyone to be executed. But before he does, he says something interesting. He says, "The teller needs a reminder. With the roles reversed, his tale is outnumbered 10,000-fold." What he means is, you can tell me a story of when you slaves defeated us, but I have 10,000 stories of when we defeated you. The Spartans come off very badly here, and they come off as villains all the way through. Question?
What should be the more accurate representation of them?
That's what I'm coming to right now. Yep. The mainstream story of Sparta for the longest time, including in 300, is the Spartans as heroic defenders of freedom. That is not particularly accurate. Classical scholars have known for years that Spartans were a lot more like in the comic book 3. They owned slaves. They were not nice to the slaves. They were not particularly nice to their women. They abused their children. That's not a story we've been very good at getting out to the general public. What I like about 300, and one of the reasons why I spend part of my time studying comic books, when a lot of other classical scholars don't, is that I think one of the best ways to tell the truth about the ancient world is to tell a really good story about it. 300 tells a great story about Sparta. It's not an accurate story. 300 also tells a great story about Sparta, and it's a much more accurate story. So actually I might leave it there because we're probably out of time. Do I have, okay. Well, question then in that case, or?
I was gonna say, the reason they act like that, would that be any way attributed to the way they were trained? Because I know the Spartans had very brutish training methods, just like whoever dies, if they weren't.
Yeah.
So it might just be like sort of either psychological scarring or like indoctrination of I am the greatest, so everyone must kneel to me. Or else.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Spartans had a particularly harsh military system. They trained their boys from a very young age to be soldiers. They practiced eugenics, so if you weren't sort of a perfect physical specimen as a baby, you would be thrown off of a cliff so that you wouldn't sort of pollute the gene pool. The ancient world was a pretty nasty place in general. Women were not treated well. Slaves were not treated well. People with disabilities weren't treated well. What has happened in the past century or so, though, is Sparta has become this symbol for democracy because they fought off the Persians, who were even worse than the Spartans. So because they became this symbol of democracy, we kind of forgot about all the bad stuff about them. And suddenly they become these really cool people who, in the movie, for instance, are loving fathers and spend a lot of time with their sons and respect their wives and all this stuff. And that's a great story, but that's not the real story. So what, for instance, 3 does is still tells a great story, but tells kind of a more accurate version of it. Other questions? Apparently I have a minute or two. I think I actually need to scoot to the next room, so maybe I should call it quits.
Thank you.
Thank you.